on democracy and comparative regionalism. We have four speakers. We go first with Mônica Hers from PUC-Rio, then Bettina Guilherme, also from PUC-Rio, Dimitris Katsikas from National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and then Nicola Vilota from the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Okay, so Monica, you can begin.
Okay,
so 20 minutes.
Thank you so much and I'm really sorry not to be there with you. I'm sure I'll be able to correct that in future meetings of this group and this very, very important project. I'm actually in Washington at the George Washington University in a project of similar concern, I would say, though a completely different take. I think that in Latin America today, unfortunately, we have at our disposition the experience of the last 4 years of the Bolsonaro government as a reference, and I'm sure it will be a reference for many years to come for our studies of the rise of the far right in our region, not only in our region, but of course, we were very unlucky to have this experience in the biggest country in the region that is so influential. And I believe that what we will be seeing in the next few years is, though Bolsonaro has fortunately lost the elections, is that you will see that the group that he represents will be fostering a far-right movement in the region that has a very strong transnational characteristic. And I think we should be looking at that, not only in terms of cooperation among different far-right groups in Latin America, but also in terms of other transnational connections, in particular with Vox party in Spain that plays a leading role in this regard. So looking at this experience that we've had for the last 4 years, I think that there are some things we can learn. I must say that this is in an article that I have just published in a special issue on Bolsonaro's foreign policy. The article is called "The Conservative Foreign Policy for Brazil." If anyone wants to take a look, I'll gladly send it to you. It just came out in Latin American Policy. So this government was elected on an anti-rights platform marked by hate speech against indigenous people, LGBTIA plus blacks to a certain extent, women to a certain extent, that we had never seen in Brazil. The construction of the enemy in very traditional, I would say, fascist terms has been going on. It is focused very much on the left, on the Workers' Party in particular. And the practice of this movement cannot be understood without this reference to the construction of the enemy. Cleansing the nation from these alleged corrupting influences has been put forward as a mission and still is. Family, religion, and patriotism are the core conservative values upon which Bolsonaro won the elections 4 years ago and has governed. His government's policies and discourse, of course, stand within a wider tradition of far-right movements that are anti-cosmopolitan, that defend extreme nationalism illiberalism, and an obsession with anti-communism. The idea of a leader that is a protector that becomes a myth is also very, very central. I believe that in order to understand our experience during the last 4 years, the work that has been developed by Wendy Brown and and some, of course, other people, but I have been really focusing on her work, is fundamental because I think she allows us to see the lines of continuity between this experience in terms of a broader understanding of the far right, or even the fascist movements in the 20s and 30s, but also the peculiarity of this experience today. And I think that we should start by discussing this authoritarian view of the world, and then add to it conservatism, and then add to it a concept of liberty. So, of course, we know that this is taking place within a broader context of a crisis of liberal democracy and representative democracy. But I don't see, and we can discuss this, a direct correlation between the crisis of liberal democracy and representative mechanisms and the rise of the far right. Of course, Wendy Brown is not trying to explain why the rise takes place, but how it takes place. So I think it's important to focus on authoritarianism as a concept, and remember that we have been discussing this for many, many years. At least Adorno's work in the 50s, or Lenin's work in the 60s are a reference for this debate, and that mostly we look at a tendency for the concentration of power in contrast to ideas of control of this concentration through many different institutional and political mechanisms. So concentration of power, seen as something that is positive, that generates order, is very much in line with an authoritarian tradition. And a second element that I would point out is the openness for the use of violence. Authoritarian traditions not necessarily lead to the use of violence in every circumstance, but open a window of opportunity, let's say, for the use of violence in public life, in political life. And I think this is present today and was present in the process that took place during the last 4 years in Brazil, as a number of institutions were attacked or destroyed. And as violence was very explicitly put on the table as a positive behavior, this became, of course, very clear in the change of so many laws on gun control, and even a discourse and images of gun use. So I think we fit well in terms of understanding an authoritarian stream in Latin America. Of course, I'm not saying there wasn't resistance. There was enormous resistance, and I think at this point, resistance is celebrating a victory. So don't misunderstand me, please. But the other thing that is important is how this authoritarian tendency becomes enmeshed with a conservative worldview. And the core cells of this conservative worldview are, of course, the family and the nation. Uh, the idea of patriotism, nationalism as some worldview that you accept as essential, as positive by definition, and in particularly this idea that you should be passionate about it. It's an emotional relation with the nation, and the so I mean we could of course turn back to the Romantic movement and 19th century to see where this comes from. And it was recast in Brazil during the last 4 years. But the family is crucial. And of course, a very, very specific image of the family, where all the movements of inclusion of different forms of family are despised, where the idea that there's something called gender ideology that is destroying families and childhood. In the specific case of the Bolsonaro government, I was really impressed by, and I'm sure Paula can understand this better than I can, but impressed by the manner in which you're almost sort of driven to a psychoanalytical analysis of the discourse, because of the manner in which it treats sexuality and brings sexuality to the center of the debate in a very, very, very sick manner. But this family is considered crucial, and it's the essence of the Christian family. It's a man, a woman, children, with very, very clear sexual definitions. Nothing is to be questioned. Nothing is to be discussed. Moreover, that family has a crucial role to play in the definition of liberty, which is the third point that it is important to include in our understanding of these movements. And this, I think, is different from the fascist experience in the 20s and 30s. The emphasis, and I think it's perhaps the strongest point of Wendy Brown's discussion, how an extreme liberal view of liberty, a certain concept of liberty, is emphasized. It's based on the idea that there should be a constant expansion of market rationality. So liberty is associated with market rationality and not with so many other things that it could be, of course, associated with. Moreover, it's associated with the Darwinist concept of social relations. And this, I think, we saw in the manner in which the government managed the epidemic, the COVID-19 epidemic, in a very clear way. I mean, whoever is weak dies, and that's nature. So we don't have to do anything about it. We just let it take its course. So this idea is, of course, pertains also to the distribution of wealth and services. I think that if liberty is market rationality and it's a concept based on a Darwinist social view of society, it is also very much targeting the family, because our space of liberty, apart from the market, is the family. which is in itself not to say that intimacy and family life isn't important. I think it is very important. And not to say that negative liberty within the family may be a very good idea. The idea that there is a kind of absolute form of liberty within the family, of course, raises questions in terms of violence against women, which has risen in Brazil, violence against children, the role of public schools. There is a whole wide agenda attached to this idea that there is absolute liberty within not any family. It's absolute liberty within the traditional family, right? So we are put in a position in which the agency of the state or international institutions to generate more equality or inclusive policies or socialize the population in terms of common denominators. This is all put aside. The role for this public agent, the state or others, is really minimized by this vision of a society. And then you may ask, but didn't you say it's authoritarian? Didn't you say there's going to be more concentration of power? Yes, there's going to be more concentration of power, but always geared towards security, always geared towards, so this state that fundamentally has to, of course, guarantee that tradition will thrive, but should focus its energies and focus the resources on dealing in a very harsh way with forms of criminality very widely defined. I think that to this vision of the world that we can now study in terms of the Bolsonaro experience in Brazil, there is one additional element to add, and this is brought to the table not by Wendy Brown, but by Ubinafti's discussion of the idea of citizens as spectators. So at the same time that, public life is really put aside, and of course this is contradictory with movements of lorry drivers blocking roads, but fundamentally the idea of this conservative view or anti-democratic view, Ubinati uses the term populism, is that citizens are spectators, and of course consumers, individuals are consumers, and they should not be spectators in terms of being consumers. But the whole debate on participation, political participation, is also treated with, in the least, a lot of suspicion. So I think these authors, these ideas help us understand this experience, help us understand the fact that this government may be out of power in January, but the movement is there. It's transnational. It's influential in Latin America. It is embedded in certain religious practices. So I think we really need to be looking at this in the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica. I really appreciate it. So I give the floor now to Bettina.
Can see the PowerPoint, the slides. I will see it there. Can you put the slides here? How I have to do it?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Press ask first, I guess.
Mhm.
So we can leave Zoom. Yeah. I think it's probably here.
Here. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But I think we have to share the screen so they can see it as well.
Exactly, but you have to share that screen first.
And bigger. The other. Yeah. First. Yes. So I use this. So I'm very, very happy to be again within the network and active in a conference, and I want to come back to what we have been working on in the past network, which was like the connection between like the financial crisis management, the social impacts and democratic impacts, and also the consequences or impacts or the interrelationship to regionalism or integration. And today I would like to speak about three issues, if the time allows me. One, like to update what has happened now in the European Union with the new crisis, and oppose the two crisis management of the previous one with the current one, and also see the difference, what kind of different result it had as a consequence on integration and in democracy. The second, which is related, come to the point of the rule of law conditionality. So we have like a democratic crisis with Hungary and Poland, and how that was kind of resolved or basically tried to resolve with these new instruments of crisis response. And third, I want to go a little bit also in this in the direction of the Conference of the Future of Europe, which is like a model for participatory democracy, and bring in also what's happening there at the moment. So if you look at the first slide, um, we can oppose in the past financial crisis. I don't call it the Great Depression, because I really want to make the point that it started as a financial crisis. And there we saw that actually what happened is that the crisis management was taken over not within the legal framework of the European Union, but with an intergovernmental informal institution, the Eurogroup, which was then the greatest decision-taking body. And as a consequence, also, there was no involvement of the European Parliament, so there was no accountability at all and scrutiny. And that came only much later in the process, that there was some kind of responsibilization and dialogue with Eurogroup presidents and the Parliament. And the Parliament was also not at all involved in the policies that were being decided. Yeah? And also, if we come to national parliaments, the national parliaments, I mean, one of the arguments was that the ministers that are in the Eurogroup were responsible to their national parliament, but they weren't like responsible to those countries for which they were actually deciding the policies. So there was no direct accountability. Then when we look at the pandemic, this actually happened in a very different way, because all the EU countries, not only the Euro area countries, were being affected by the crisis. And so what was used was the communitarian decision taking and the ordinary decision taking procedure, which meant that it was now being done with the involvement of the European Parliament. Which meant that the European Parliament now had as much as a say as the Council in the decision of what this crisis response should have as priorities, yeah, so the main lines, and how it should be executed, and how actually also it should afterwards be controlled and put to accountability. So if to say we have established a procedure where they had already like about 60 meetings where they go through each of the national recovery plans. They look what programs the national states have, and they discuss about how is it being implemented. And there's a discussion with the Commission on it. So when we looked at what happened in the terms of monetary policy, actually in the past, what happened, that was also part of the architecture of the Economic and Monetary Union. The national member states had lost the central national central banks had lost the capacity to be lender of last resorts, but then it should have been the European Central Bank, but that one was very reluctant and had a timid response, and actually even made a policy error in 2012, where it increased the inflation and brought about a double recession, double dip. And only later we got Draghi, who said we do whatever it can in what is in his power, and started to become a lender of last resort. So this actually had the effect that the monetary policy was contractional, and at the same time we had a fiscal policy that was also not had a fiscal framework that did not foresee any solidaric responses, but it had more restrictive rules. The restrictive rules were like the for prohibition to bail out other member countries. It had no kind of fiscal capacity that would kind of intervene, not the common budget, not any other, and not the, it was prohibited to allow to take up common debt. And initially it didn't foresee financial assistance, which was curious because it did foresee it for those member states that are not in part of the euro area, but not for those that part of the euro group. Yeah, and then we come what happened now, and this is very big change, because and what we see now is that this crisis was very different in nature. uh, Everybody was concerned, all member states were affected, and there was nobody to be responsibilized and to make as the scapegoat, yeah, because in the past crisis, the peripheral countries, the debtor countries, were being made the scapegoat, and the consequence was they had to be punished. It had to be a punishment. But this time, this was not the case, and also it was really an approach that said we have learned from the past, yeah, lessons from the past, which was actually very positive. Let's not do it like we did before, and we have to act quickly. So what happened? The last time, actually, the EU would have had the same possibility to activate the general escape clause. What does it mean? That the restrictive rules of the Stability and Growth Pact would have been uplifted, yeah, for a certain time. That didn't happen. They could have done it, but they didn't do it. This time they did. So it means that the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact were actually uplifted. Um, in reality, they said they still are going to observe, but in the monitor, the procedure, but in fact, the member states were free to do whatever expansionary policies and crisis response measures that they needed. They decided to actually decided to use the budget for common debt and something.
Andrea wants me to say, Mônica, pode fechar o microfone, por favor?
Okay. They decided to use the budget. They decided to create fiscal capacities. One is called Shuri. That is a fiscal capacity to help to prevent an employment crisis, so to give financial means to help the labor markets. And they decided the Recovery and Resilience Funds, which are like even if you take it all together, the measures are 2 trillions. When it was like 1.8 trillions in the current value of the currency is 2 trillion. So this is a tremendous crisis response, and it's about equivalent to what happened in the US. So this is like for the first time that the EU was working really like a real economic and monetary currency union. And the loans also have a conditionality, but this conditionality, as I explained, was negotiated between the Council, so it's the representative of the member states, and the European Parliament. And it has specific priorities and conditions that the member states have to fulfill. But the second difference, which is also a major difference, actually it makes the broader framework of the objectives, but then the member state themselves they elaborate the plan, not the Commission. So it gives also much more ownership to the member states. Yeah, so in total, we can see that the former financial crisis response was in the end more a punitive approach. It was to punish the states that were in debt. It created a very strict conditionality, imposed an austerity that was actually strongly pro-cyclical. It had very strong negative social impacts, and it kept in invest Europe from being able to make future investments, which also went against the competition and modernization of the European Union. But so it punished mainly the debtors. It put all the burden to the debtors countries, but in fact it also had a very strong pro-cyclical effect, and it led to a protraction, a prolongation of the crisis, and a deepening of the crisis, and all the whole euro area was actually affected. In this crisis, with the co-legislation, I will afterwards show a slide with the priorities, but it was also introduced, apart from these major objectives, a rule of law conditionality. So if a country doesn't obey the rule of law, it the Commission can withhold the funds of this. And since the funds are very considerable, this has a strong impact. So now I go to the next slide. Yeah. So these were the six pillars of the National Recovery and Resilience Programs. The priorities for the investments is the green transition, the digital transition, smart, sustainable and inclusive growth, social and territorial cohesion, health and economic, social and institutional resilience, and policies for the next generation. As you can see, a lot of these policies have a social, so an equity aspect, which is very different to the previous program. So if we go now on, but I won't go too far because I think Dimitris is going to go into this aspect about legitimacy, no? So you will probably speak a lot about it, but I will shortly say how this decision in the Eurogroup were taken. So the Eurogroup is actually the finance ministers of the member states of the Euro area, and they took it in closed rooms, closed doors. Yeah, so it was not totally opaque. There was a very low at the beginning, no accountability. Later, there was some accountability that became accountability. Mainly, the finance minister go to their parliament, but in fact, since this body was had also no decision-taking rules as such, it was basically the strongest states were imposing the rules to the countries, and so the finance minister of the debtors country will more or less go home and explain we can take this package or leave it, yeah, but not really make any changes or differences. The new rules are much more transparent. They happen in co-decision, and there is like a regular accountability. As I said, we have nearly every week or every second week meetings where we discuss the programs, how they're being, how the plans have been, what plans have been submitted, and how they are being implemented. And also we have like, for example, regular contacts with the national parliaments, and to discuss also with them that they hold their national governments accountable in the implementation. We have also meetings with the stakeholders, the social partners, where we're discussing how far they are involved. They were not satisfactorily involved because the programs had to be made very quickly. So this is a big critic which we try to amend. Yeah, if we see output democracy, the last crisis and management led to a protection and a deepening of the crisis, and it lasted more than 10 years. Europe was in a crisis for 10 years because of a very bad management of the crisis. And in this management, it was counter-cyclical, and within 1.5 years, the whole of the European Union managed to get to the GDP levels before the pandemic. So a very, very different result also. What I also want to mention, that goes along with what Monica said and what before, actually the previous crisis led to a lot of animosity. So because the discussions were held in public fights and accusations and culpabilization, the lazy Southerners that spent the money on women and wine and so this created both in the central countries animosity and more nationalism and decreased voluntarity to actually be solidaric and help and also a big humiliation and animosity, of course, in the part of the debtor countries against the stronger countries. There was very little, since these programs were decided, were basically imposed on the debtor countries, there was very little ownership to them too. In these programs, there's much more spirit of solidarity and common aims. So there's both the framework decided at EU level, the national plans are decided at national level. So this leads to a more ownership too. Uh, the previous program led to much more public discontent. We had seen at that moment this massive mobilizations, demonstrations, the social movements like Indignados, Syriza. We had seen coming up the polarization, the populism, the loss of confidence and trust of traditional parties, and the mushrooming of new parties, yeah, more right wing, more Eurosceptic also. So the while this time actually there was a lot of support for the response of the European Union and the acceptance of the European Union. Um, if we come back, also Brexit, I think, was also partly a consequence of the bad management. And there was also a loss of prestige and influence of the European Union in the world, of the image of the European Union through the bad management. The management at the moment, the image of the EU now is much improved. So, yeah, so I would now like to come. Yeah, no, and I would like to mention something that we discussed yesterday about the nationalism that has come into being at that moment. The problem is that when this nationalism has been created and these groups, same like in Brazil, they don't go away from one day to the next, and they can come up again in the next crisis. Yeah, so you will suffer the consequences of such a increase of nationalism. I don't know, maybe for decades or perhaps forever, and the consequences on the traditional party system also because we have much less these big parties. There's many more parties now all over Europe and probably also in other countries of the world. 3 minutes. Oh no, okay. Very sorry. So then I come very briefly. There was also one aspect about the democracy, rule of law, and fundamental human rights that is a part of the RRF agreements. Because the Article 7, that was the mechanism that exists in the European treaties, which had like a preventative and sanction arm, was not very effective because there was never a real sanction being implemented because of the decision taking process. So now basically if there is a member state that does not accept the rule of law, the Commission can withhold the budget of the budget of the RRF and the recovery. And this is actually what they have at the moment decided for Hungary. It has been decided in September 2021. So at the moment, the European Union did not pay out any of the means to Hungary. So it withholds 7.5. No, what did I do? 7.5 billions, but would get another 5.4 billions, which is amounts to about 8% of the GDP of Hungary if they don't compromise and improve the measures. And for 8.5, yeah, here. So Hungary has some implemented some measures, but they have not been considered satisfactory by at the moment. And Poland even risk to be withhold 75 billion. their recovery plan has been, for the moment, been accepted, but no financial means have been paid out before they actually implement some milestones in the judiciary reforms. So I leave, maybe I take very shortly on the conference of the future of Europe. This has been a unique experience where 800 um, European citizens worked out together with online panels and conferences all over of Europe with participation of more than 650,000 participants. Were elaborating proposals for the future of Europe. These proposals are now 49 proposals. They of course have measures that are very broad. They are like from environmental sustainability, green transition, more social policy, more energy autonomy, more policy in health, changing the decision-taking mechanism of the European and where necessary. So where you can where you can implement the proposals within the normally decision-taking procedure, it should be done like this. When otherwise there should be a treaty change. And the three institutions of the European Union, so the Commission has screened all the proposals and already online put the measures that they can make with the ordinary legislation procedures and explicitly told which ones can be done already without changing the treaties. The European Parliament has seen that there is a number of proposals that need treaty change and has called for a convention. So a convention is to make a change the treaties, which is the constitution of the European Union. And we are at the moment working out a report. So each of the committees in his field works out proposals which changes must be made in the treaties of the European Union in the area. And the council is at the moment the one that is blocking. So the French government had wanted to put it on the decision to call also the convention for the treaty change. But the Czech presidency now is rather conservative. I don't know how the Swedish is. It's a right-wing government, so I guess they will not really promote the treaty change for the time being. But that's why in the parliament they have prolonged the procedure, so we will work out our proposal until the summer next year, and then hope that maybe the presidency after the Swedish will take up the proposal. So I've been too long, sorry about that.
It's okay. Only 2 minutes for your time. Thank you very much, Bettina. Okay, we go to Dimitris now, but let me just leave here. Okay, so Dimitris, the floor is yours.
And you see the
Yes.
presentation? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Again, I'm sorry also not to be there, but we can do this online. One of the few positive legacies, perhaps, of the pandemic. Bettina mentioned some already at the level of the European Union. I'm going to talk a bit in a similar area to that Bettina was referring to earlier in her presentation. So I'm going to talk about democratic legitimacy in the EU. During the perma crisis, this new term has been added recently in the literature, which effectively refers to a permanent state of crisis, which affects the world, but even more perhaps so in the 21st century, the European Union and its member states. So we see that there are a lot of crises taking place in the past 15, 20 years. And all of these, of course, are within the context of a broader, ever developing and evolving climate crisis. In my view, at least, this perma crisis, if we can call it that, the continuous manifestation of crisis episodes contribute to political instability, to the rise of populism we witnessed in the last 2 decades, to a deterioration of the quality of governments in many countries, and to the rise, particularly for Europe, the European Union, in the rise of Euroscepticism. Um, Not all of them to the same degree. My point is that the way that the EU handles this crisis will largely determine, and largely has determined up to now, the attitudes of Europeans, particularly towards European integration. But also it affects the quality of democratic politics in Europe because EU politics and national European politics are very closely related um, in the 21st century. Um, as Bettina said, this is work that continues from our previous projects. I had a similar walk down for the team back then. So briefly to recap some of that previous work, there is a lot of literature around the issue of the democratic legitimacy in the European Union, and I think there's a consensus that EU integration was mostly driven by output legitimacy before the global financial crisis. There is a big debate in the literature about the so-called democratic deficits in EU, and this has two aspects, if you like. One is an institutional one, in the sense that the institutions, the procedures, the operation, the input aspect of democratic legitimacy in the EU, for example, the role and powers of the European Parliament, the way parliamentarians, the European Parliament are elected, the importance, relevance in European elections, in national politics, and so on. The absence of European parties, political parties, real European political parties. So all these have been associated with a lack of or weak democratic legitimacy at the EU level, at least. And also, of course, there's a social cultural aspect in the sense that in EU, particularly up to the global financial crisis, were largely viewed as a elite-driven process, something very far away from the average European citizen. I mean, there were many surveys, and most people did not know what the EU was doing, what its powers were, how it fits into their lives. Mostly they saw some of the funding from structural funds, cohesion policy funds, in major infrastructure projects, and so on. But other than that, for most people, for the average citizen, the EU was something that was very far away from their daily lives. However, this low input legitimacy was tolerated, and EU was never really a big issue in national politics, because it was thought, and the empirical record at it then, supported that view, that joining the EU and being part of the EU and the Eurozone was something which helped the country, member states, economically, and it delivered prosperity for its people. And therefore, this seemed to be enough for most European citizens. Again, there was a pretty much consensus about different countries' European trajectory inside for joining and developing inside the EU integration framework. Now, as Bettina showed in much more detail than I will do, the way the global financial crisis and the Eurozone debt crisis that followed, the way they were handled, undermined substantially, even further, the democratic legitimacy of the Eurozone and the EU, particularly in the countries of the Eurozone periphery, which were the hardest hit by the crisis. I mean, there are many, many things we can say about that. The way the handling of the crisis undermined democratic legitimacy, not only at the EU level, but also at the national political level. But some of the main issues where, for example, at the terms of the bailouts were dictated by the creditors pretty much. There was very little, at least at the negotiating phase of the major policy priorities. There was relatively little input from the countries in crisis. These were not really debated inside the countries, and therefore we have what Smith has called policies without politics. These were the major priorities and major policy directions were downloaded, in a sense, from the creditors, and therefore also in most cases, the lack of socioeconomic supports. This is understandable because many of the policies had to do with were austerity policies or internal devaluation policies, which, as Bettina said, had devastating effects on domestic economies and prolonged and deepened the crisis in cases. And of course, there was also an institutional aspect in the sense that the way these decisions were taken, there was institutional opacity, the negotiations decisions were not very transparent, the intergovernmental mode of negotiation prevailed, and we had this constant state of emergency evoked. So most of these measures we had, like in Greece, for example, we had like 1,000 pages long laws passed through parliament, which effectively implemented many of these measures. And the parliament had like 2 or 3 days to read, discuss, and approve them, so which is not possible, obviously. So the parliament effectively rubber stamped these kind of measures, and no real political debates was taking place about all these issues. So an already relatively low democratic legitimacy was suffered a further blow during the crisis. But the output legitimacy, which was good, which the strong points of EU membership, but then also suffered as a result of all these negative economic developments because of the crisis and also because of the policies implemented during the crisis. So the result was that EU's already low democratic legitimacy further undermined, particularly in the crisis countries. But another, perhaps more damaging consequence is something that Bettina mentioned as well, that the democratic legitimacy of domestic political institutions and domestic political elites was also seriously undermined. And this led in many countries to serious reshaping of the political landscape domestically, with the breaking up of former major parties, of the central right, of the central left, and the emergence of many new parties, many of them populist or radical. And therefore, we had a rise of populism and Euroscepticism because the common theme usually among these parties is that they attack Europe and the EU as a whole. And this was not only the case in the south, but also in the north. For example, the true Finns rose in a Finnish political system, arguing to a large extent that Greece should not get a bailout. The first bailout was one of the main campaign slogans. AfD in Germany also had similar proposals. So this kind of contributed to this division of Europe between the north and the south. The south being aggravated by the policies and the economic pain inflicted on it, and complaining about the lack of economic solidarity in Europe. In the north, populist parties in the north making the issue that we are paying for the irresponsible behavior of the south. Now, the refugee crisis kind of reinforced this trend, but strengthened particularly radical, populist, radical, far-right parties throughout Europe, particularly in the north, in Eastern Europe and in the north. And in addition to the north-south divide, we're also starting seeing a west-east divide, which was relative to this particular issue. On the other hand, during that same period, 2015, 16, 17, 18, there was a gradual economic recovery in the Eurozone and the EU after the crisis. And this helped to restore the image and but to a lesser extent the trust. I will show you some data afterwards towards the EU and the euro, which is also consistent with the output legitimacy hypothesis. That is, as soon as the material conditions improve, the image and the legitimacy of the EU and in particular seems to rebound to some degree. However, as I said before, the damage to credibility and legitimacy of the domestic institutions is much harder to overcome. And we have a stabilization during the period of many anti-systemic and populist parties, which makes democratic recovery harder. Now, as Bettina very nicely described, the pandemic was a boost, a positive boost towards restoring credibility and trust towards the European Union, but also domestic political systems in many countries. Um, uh, there is evidence of less of learning, policy learning during the pandemic, because you see there were, as Bettina described earlier on, there were many instances when really the EU um, adopted a very different approach compared to that in the previous crisis. For example, the European Settlement Bank was very active from the beginning, very early on, within weeks of the outbreak of the pandemic. It started very active and very energetic, um, put forward a very energetic, very substantial policy package. The European Commission also exhibited similar activism. It spearheaded various proposals, like, for example, the relaxation of the fiscal rules that Bettina described, also the relaxation of the state aid rules that allowed governments to support businesses in trouble. It started the Rescue program, which is about building a repository of medical supplies. It tried to issue guidelines to protect the integrity of the common market, because this was undermined at the very beginning by national, panicked responses to the crisis. And there was increased cooperation also gradually in terms of in the health and crisis management areas, where traditionally the EU has not had a big impact. So more cooperation in medical research, in crisis management, and also, of course, very importantly, the common provision of vaccines. This was very, very important. And we've done work that shows, that if that was not the case, and if in the EU countries procure vaccines the same way that they did globally, there would be a very, very different distribution of vaccines across the EU, and countries like Greece would take much fewer vaccines compared to what they actually did. And of course, the next generation EU, with a lot of funds that Bettina talked about already. So this, as you see here, pretty much helps restore the image of the EU to pre-global financial crisis levels. You see the blue line, it's up to 50%, goes down during the crisis periods in the 2000s and goes up almost to the same levels now. And the reverse image for the negative views about the EU. The same picture we get about, this is, by the way, this is data from the latest Eurobarometer in the summer 2022, and some other slides from a special survey done in the spring this year. Again, you see the same again, pretty much significant decline during 2010s, and then gradually restoration of trust in the European Union. You see that in very recent years, although 2019, 2020, the confidence in actual government will restore to previous levels, and actually higher than previous levels. In the past year or two, it's going down again. And I think this has to do a lot with the energy crisis and inflation crisis that people are experiencing now. So this perhaps is starting to have an impact on national politics. This picture, of course, hides many very, very differences. You see here that for 9 countries, I think, yes, Italy is, the balance is negative. For my country as well, Greece, you see here, 60%, this is the trust question, 60% still tend not to trust the EU, compared to 37%. And this is the same for another 8 countries, and Italy is on the balance, 46% tend and not to trust, and not to trust as well. So it's the same. So we do still have a large group of countries that are where population is pretty reserved still vis-a-vis the EU. The pandemic, as shown before, also by Bettina, has had a positive impact. And you can see here, you can see that 56% are satisfied with the way the EU dealt with the pandemic. This is higher than similar percentage. The corresponding percentage about national governments, which is again is satisfactory. Let's say it's 49%. I think here this graph shows a bit better the impact of the pandemic. This is asking citizens if now, after the way the pandemic was handled, you trust the EU more. And you can see here, so it's a trust question, but after after taking consideration exactly how the EU handled the pandemic, and you can see here that while before there were 9 countries with negative balances in trust, now it's only 1. So after the pandemic and the way this was handled by the EU, people in European countries have developed more trust in the EU to handle crises and to make the right decisions in the future. So we do see that there is evidence that the way the EU handled the pandemic has had a very positive effect on people's trust. And now we come, of course, to the Russian invasion in Ukraine and ensuing energy and inflation crisis, which are a major challenge, again, in a new double-pronged, if you like, big crisis. With the geopolitical aspect and economic aspects. Again, if you look at the surveys, the Eurobarometers, you see that the majority, a large majority, 60 or over percent of Europeans on the whole are on board with the EU's response to the crisis. But we also see that, the energy costs and the inflation are starting to have an impact because these now are, you can see that here, these are now the top of the considerations for European citizens. You see, first of all, the rising prices, inflation, cost of living, the energy supply and the international situation, which did not exist at all before as a factor. So these 3 are now the top priorities for European citizens. So definitely this is, becoming these are becoming very key issues for European voters. And we see this in recent elections, that this new uncertainty perhaps has affected recent elections. These are some of the most important elections in 2022. And you see again that we had either strengthening or solidifying the position far-right parties in Europe.
Okay.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes, okay?
Okay, yes. With brothers of Italy in Italy, Swedish Democrats, Sweden's gaining an even better majority than before, and of course, the very strong performance also of the National Party in France. So we do see this kind of, as I mentioned before, and also Bettina mentioned, this kind of, in the domestic arena, this kind of solidification of these kinds of parties, which of course will make progress going forward into the future much more difficult. You see here that people are more generally satisfied with the response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. A couple of final notes. Despite the criticism, the EU is considered as a safe haven for Europeans. You see here the support for the euro. It's really very interesting to see that despite the crisis in the Eurozone, actually support for the euro increased compared to pre-global financial crisis era, actually substantially by 10 percentage points. Now it's 80%, it used to be 70%. And I think we saw this in Greece as well. In Greece, that's really even stronger, this increase, this improvement. I think people, although they disagree with the policies implemented, they feel that they were much safer within the Eurozone context rather than outside that. And actually, for many Europeans, more integration, not less, is the answer. You see here, for example, the answers to the question if you would like to see a common defense and security policy. And you see that close to 80% of Europeans say they would like to see that. So closer cooperation in defense and security. So even more integration in a very political field of policy. So to conclude, Europe and the world face structural challenges, which are key drivers of populism and political stability. We have migration pressures, we have technological developments like AI and the pressure they put on in the future pressure will probably put on labor markets, international competition, economic inequalities, all these um, anyway push towards populism and political instability and radical parties. Big crises which are related to these developments make things even worse, and they're coming with increasing frequency. And as I said before, given they use um, that the EU legitimacy hinges on its ability to deliver good results for European citizens. Its ability to handle efficiently this crisis will determine largely whether these political seats will become dominant or they will be contained. I think in the long term, in order to improve the democratic legitimacy of the EU, we need to go beyond this output aspect of legitimacy and build more the democratic aspect of legitimacy in Europe. What Europe is like is a demos, if you like, a more democratic, a more political aspect of integration. This will help contain hard Euroscepticism, so resistance against the EU as such, and then criticism can be, concentrated more on fruitful discussion about direction of specific policies, how to handle specific problems, and not so much to overturn the entire European integration process and all the achievements it has accomplished to date. Thank you, and sorry for going a bit over time.
Okay, Dimitris, thank you very much. Okay, so Nicola, maybe you can come here so we can show in the screen. Here.
Christian, he can put the
Compartir la pantalla. Come si fa in spagnolo qua?
It's already here.
Ok, aspetta, voglio fare in spagnolo. Yeah, this one. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So my presentation is going to be a bit less orthodox than the other ones. I'm going to talk about a topic which is very hot and sexy lately, which is central bank digital currency. And first of all, at the beginning, I wanted to focus my presentation on the issue of privacy within central bank digital currency, but I think it's important also speaking with my colleagues yesterday to give a broader frame on why digital money matters. So why, let's say, there is a geostrategic implication in the development of central bank digital currencies, and ultimately try to see why, this is a window of opportunity to actually foster cooperation between European Union and Latin American countries. And I go back to the figures that Andrea showed yesterday, right? The European Union is still a strong partner for many Latin American countries in terms of export as well as foreign direct investments. So CBDC ultimately offers the opportunity to reduce transaction costs and potentially empower even more bilateral trade agreements. Okay, the first question I'm not going to answer is how to get rich with crypto assets. That is the first slide I always have when I speak about digital money, because I can speak about privacy, I can speak about monetary policy, I can speak about digital one. But at the end of the day, the first question I always get is, well, how to get money with crypto? And the answer is, if I knew, I was not here, right? I would be in Bali probably. Jokes aside, I'm going to focus my presentation then on two main topics. The first one is weaponization, fragmentation, and digitalization. And the second one is privacy and CBDC. And privacy is very relevant because in the end of the day, why people are concerned about digital one, why there is so much attention, especially from the US, about the surveillance system that the digital one could put in place, and why the digital euro could actually become a global model also for Latin American countries. So the first one is, you probably know that the weaponization of finance has been a foreign policy tool of the US. One of the major foreign policy tools of the US is also the US dollar role in financial markets. Why is secondary sanction so efficient? Because every sort of financial transaction grows through either US providers, Visa and MasterCard. Also in Europe, two-thirds of financial transactions are going through Visa and MasterCard, which are US providers. So when the US unilaterally implementing sanctions against Iran, even though the European Union said to European companies, feel free to make business with Iran, no European companies did anything because they were afraid to incur in secondary sanction, so being cut from the US financial market. And even SWIFT, which is based in Belgium, and even though it's a no-profit, consortium or whatever, they also kind of, comply with US secondary sanction. So we know that money has a political value. We know that money has a geopolitical value. So it doesn't surprise that China has invested so much in trying to developing its digital yuan, because it sees as an opportunity to actually reduce its dependency on the US dollar. And the weaponization of finance, such a coordinating action from Western powers, scared them off even more. If you read the white papers, the political statement by the People's Bank of China, this geopolitical dimension is always very stressed, because they know that if tomorrow the decoupling between the US and China is going to get even deeper, if tomorrow the US put sanction against China, China is going to incur in serious problems. Of course, China is not Russia, so I don't know if European powers would comply with that, but still, and technology is already empowering a diversification in terms of international currencies. You probably know, macroeconomic lesson class number 1, a currency has 3 main functions: store of value, medium of payment, and unit of account. And the US is basically the global leader in these 3 different functions. If we see the store of value, and this is a beautiful paper published last year, you can see that the US, the currency composition of global foreign exchange reserves have seen a decreasing in terms of percentage of the US dollar from 70% in the 1999 to 60%, actually 59% in 2021. So we have seen a 11% drop. And even more interestingly, it's not about the yuan becoming, an alternative to the US dollar, because we know that, the yuan has serious macroeconomic constraints, capital controls, etc., etc., etc. It's not about the euro. If we observe the use of the euro internationally, we see that it was actually slowly, but eventually, trying to catch up with the US dollar. But the 2007 crisis played a key role there. After, global markets saw that the European Union was unable to implement macroeconomic coordinated policies, the international role of the euro actually dropped. And you can observe also this graph in terms of store of value. So it was growing, and after the crisis, 2007, it started decreasing. Why the US dollar then has decreased from 70 to 59%? Well, because digitalization, electronic platform, actually has reduced transaction costs. What does it mean? It means that central banks, it means that private institutions now can access different currencies for lower cost. So diversification is actually be driven by the acquisition of smaller currencies like the Canadian dollar or the South Korean, I don't remember the name. So basically, we already seen, like a sort of diversification that can be also driven by risk management. So countries are trying to diversify their composition of global currency exchange to get less dependence from the US dollar. Second issue, if you see the currency domination of imports, again, the US dollar has a global leadership. In Europe, which is the largest the largest energy importer in the world, the majority of contracts are denominated in the US dollar, not in euro, even in euro. But again, here we are already observing a trend of fragmentation. After the war, we have seen countries like India or Saudi Arabia redenominating contracts for the export or import of energy from the US dollar to national currencies. So for example, between India and Russia, now Russia and China, for example, the denomination of the contract has moved from the US dollar to the national currency. This is very important. Secondly, when we talk about payments, in payments is actually quite interesting because the euro actually has a stronger international role because like the European Union is one of the largest and richest economy in the world, and if we think about corporate and retail transaction with the European Union, they are all processed in euro. So basically, in terms of like volume and quantity, it's fine. But the trick here is that, as I said before, the majority of transactions are processed through US payment systems. So there is also a dependency in that case. So why do we talk about CBDC? Why do we talk about, actually, everybody knows what CBDCs are, right? Yes, basically it's a sort of digital cash. So it's a liability issued by the central bank. And internally speaking, for users, nothing is gonna change because as you access, your e-wallets and you pay using Google Pay, Apple Pay, whatever pay you can find as an app, you're gonna access an app like Google Pay, you're gonna pay with a CBDC. What matters is the liability because you're not using bank deposit money, but you're using a liability issued by the central bank directly. So if we think about the role of CBDC internationally, so why right now there is such a discussion about the potential implication of a CBDC is that right now payments go through intermediary nodes. For example, let's say that I need to send money to Kai, right, in Brazil, and my small bank in Italy doesn't have a correspondent in banking in Brazil, because you know that nowadays the transactions are processed through correspondent in banking. So my small bank is going to speak to a big Italian bank, that's going to speak to a big Brazilian bank, that's going to speak to the small Brazilian bank of Kai. So there are a lot of intermediate nodes, right? And after this, Visa, MasterCard, SWIFT. So there are many different intermediary nodes which are controlled by US firms or by US providers. Well, you can see in the first lane, the origin banking, restaurant banking, foreign market, foreign bank. So there are like many different nodes. With a CBDC arrangement, this is going to disappear. What happens is that central banks are going to set a system where they're going to be able to speak directly to each other. So banks are going to be connected, let's say this, to their central banks, and that is going to completely cut intermediary nodes. What does it mean? Is that you can potentially reduce transaction costs, and that has serious implication in the remittance market, for example. We know for a fact that right now the remittance market is one of the most expensive and inefficient market in the world. Anytime you send $200 abroad, you pay around $20 as fees, between fees and currency exchange loss. So potentially this is going to disrupt completely the financial market. It seems easy. It's not, of course. That is why, it's very complicated, because what you need to do, you need to have central banks establishing interoperable system. So systems that are able to communicate between themselves. And here is where China is playing a key role again. China is completely aware that this is going to be the future. This is going to be the future of our international system. I'm not talking about in 5 years' time. I'm not talking about 8 years' time, but in 20 years' time, this is how international transactions are going to settle. I'm pretty sure, at least. And so what you need to do is you need to speak with another central bank. You need to develop an infrastructure, a technology infrastructure that speaks the same language. And there are many different projects right now, between central banks around the world that are experimenting these systems, right? And the leading experiment is actually led by the People's Bank of China, Hong Kong, Bank of Thailand, and it's called the United Emirates States. How do you say?
United Arab
Yes. There are many different, there are many different experiments. The Bank of France is involved in other projects, but basically, what matters is that while other countries like the European Union are still thinking about, should we launch a digital euro? Should we launch a CBDC? In China, it already exists. The Winter Games, actually, in the plan of the Chinese government, was supposed to be let's say the show to the world that the digital one was working, and that is why the United government was already concerned about tourists going to the Winter Games and using the digital one. And that, when we talk about privacy, we're gonna understand why. So, what I wanna, with this first part of my presentation, the key message here is that technology allows potentially to reduce transaction cost, which is already an incentive to adapt the system. So when people say, oh, why should I use like a digital one or a digital euro? Well, because you're gonna pay less in transaction cost. It's very easy, and that is already an incentive. And it's an incentive for countries. Also, by the way, the European Union, if you read Panetta political statement, Panetta, the executive board of the European Central Bank, who is the main sponsor of the digital euro, anytime he talks about digital euro, he's always stressing that the European Union is dependent on foreign providers. Because if you think about the next generation or the current generation of payments, in Europe, the most popular e-wallets are Google Pay, Apple Pay. Where are they from? United States. If you see the stable coins, market, the stable coins anchored, so denominated in euro, are like such a small niche. All the stable coins market is based on the US dollar, which is already a sort of like, proxy to also improve the circulation and the consolidation of the US the US dollar in the international markets. That is why it's very important to look at the geostrategic dimension of central bank digital currencies. So if we go now very quickly to privacy, which is the most important feature of cash, is that you go to a shop, you buy your cigarette, you buy your legal weed, or you buy whatever you want, you pay with cash, and nobody knows, right? Maybe there is a camera that records your face, but still, there is no direct track. Anytime you're paying with a credit card or an e-wallet, you're leaving a track. And if we think about China, for example, in China, 66% of total payments, of total retail payments, are done through mobile apps. Of these 66%, 92 are processed by only two providers, WeChat and Alipay. Do you understand the kind of amount of data that private providers can accumulate? That is crazy. And we are lucky because in Europe, our banks have no idea how to use data. That is the issue. Their system are built on so old-fashioned infrastructure that are unable to implement artificial intelligence, machine learning to actually properly, let's say, exploit data. But these guys know how to do it because these are technology companies. So anytime we're using Google Pay, I use it. Google Pay, Apple Pay, these guys know how to use our transactional data. They know. For example, 4 years ago, there was a scandal in the US because Google acquired billions of data from MasterCard of US consumers. They paid, we don't know how much. Why they did it? So that they can, cross-checks your personal data. Let's say that Kai wants to buy a bike, right? He goes to Google and say, old bikes, vintage bike, whatever. So Google knows that he's looking for a bike. He knows if he is entering an online shop, right? He knows if he's buying the bikes online. Maybe he said, no, I want to see it, you're right? I want to see. So he goes out, he goes in Google Maps, he put the name of a shop, he goes inside the shop, and he buys the bike, right? Google is missing that piece of information. But if he can access Kai's transactional data, it can match all the dots and can go to the advertisement and say, go to the company that sells bikes and say, you know what? My advertising services, I can track a cluster of customers and I can tell you what they're looking for, if they're paying online and if they're paying physically. So basically, cash, allows consumers and citizens to a degree of privacy, which is very important because privacy is also like an equilibrium of power between us, the citizens, and the government. So like here, just to give you a few snapshots. So global non-cash transaction increased by 80% since 2014. So we are talking about a remarkable increase. The problem with the privatization, because non-cash transactions are by default intermediated by private corporations, which means that they are able to accumulate more data and are also able to monetize our transactional data. And here there is the equilibrium between cash anonymity and digital payments. The European Central Bank launched a survey a few months ago on which features a digital euro should have. And look, the first feature, the first concern of citizen is privacy. Why? Because a CBDC system technically would allow the government to monitor all transactions that you do with that currency. So let's say that you are in a, yes, 2 minutes, very quickly. If you're like in an authoritarian country, you go to a protest, right? Technically, the government could potentially frozen your CBDC account in 1 second. In 1 second. Or if you go to China as a tourist, right, and you use a digital one, the government would know exactly what you're buying, where you're going. So, you know, the potential implication in terms of accumulation of power of the government are huge. And that is like a main concern of citizens as well of the European Central Bank. There is like, very quickly, if you read all the discussion that's going on, the European Central Bank is very concerned about it, and they're like trying to study technical solution for privacy. And the key message here that I want to give is that it's not a technical issue. There are technical solutions to create, establish by design a system that guarantee some privacy, some degree of privacy. For example, there is like a proposal by the European Central Bank that each user would receive a voucher which he could spend in CBDC completely anonymous. So the central bank, by default, would not track, would not accumulate data on those transactions. And that would, let's say, give some cash features also to digital euro. What is the problem? Is that this degree of privacy and security, right? Because you can't just give complete anonymous to transaction, otherwise you can't implement anti-money laundering, tax evasion, blah, blah, blah. Is that is a political decision. And that is why, for me, it's very important right now to advocate, to speak with the European Central Bank as civil society, as academia, as think tank, because we need to make sure that the future digital euro, because it's going to happen, even though we are not sure about it, you know, there's still like the roadmap, blah, blah, but it's going to happen, that the digital euro, by design, includes degree of privacy, which is guaranteed by third-party supervision. And with this, I'm going to conclude. This is like about how the European Union can also shape, you know, digital euro soft power. Basically, nobody wants to use a digital one infrastructure because nobody, you know, is like very confident and trust, you know, the Chinese system. So the European Union should try to push towards a further cooperation with other countries, which should not only be Western allies, but also Latin American countries. And this is an opportunity to develop a new system, a new monetary system, which is independent from the US dollar and from US bodies, and is more based on let's say independent nodes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for a very passionate presentation. Okay, it's 11:40. The other session is supposed to start at 11:45, but I guess we can have 15 minutes of questions. Yes. So before, I have a few questions, but I want to know if anyone in the audience has questions.
No, you too.
Okay, so I want the audience to go first.
How do you put it bigger?
Okay. No, she left. Monica left.
Deja de compartir ya.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for our presentation. My question is for Nicola. Your presentation was very interesting. How the world need to obtain other way, other financial system related to the new transactions. For me, it's wonderful. criminal organizations, do they use this type of financial process? How to use the crypto moneda or other CBD processes, but how to control or how to recommend to stop this case, no? Because there are a lot of risks. It's true that El Salvador use a crypto moneda like a new policy. And also in Arabia Saudita there are other projects, for example, Neon City, and this is the future. But what happens with the risk? The risk. What control and regulate this type of risk for the international or the criminal organization? Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the presentations. And it was great to see Bettina's and Dimitri's discussion, because we have to remember the beginning when we started working on that, still during the 2008 crisis, or very, very close to it. And it's amazing to see from that historical perspective and to see the changes, of course, at the EU level, the policy changes, and to a certain extent, a positive impact as well that was possible. And at the same time, when we linked to yesterday's panel and Monica's presentation, to put in context that this democratic problem is, of course, there's a global context to it. So what I think it's interesting for us to think is that, of course, at the EU level, there is a lot of instruments and mechanisms to deal with all of these issues, especially at the regional level vis-a-vis the national ones. But I mean, since we are seeing that the question of democracy, there is other elements, I mean, global level elements, structural elements. I think for us to keep us thinking about how, because we, of course, we focus a lot on Latin America, but we all follow what happened in the US and Trump. And as Monica was saying, somebody left, but I know that she's working in this project that also to follow the coalitions or the connections between this far right, the focus there, I think it's a lot of US and Latin America, but of course she also mentioned Spain. So I think in our own research here, to put as a question to you both, is how to incorporate that, because it seems that the EU has done a lot to the internal aspect of the response and democratic economic governance and so on. So my push would be, how can the EU incorporate that in the external relations, like because we see that relations with the US is relevant, of course, with Latin America is relevant. I mean, something that relates to my own presentation yesterday, how in the cooperation we can put democracy as an issue, because some of the democratic problems, like even for the youth, like Hungary is there or one is there, is not only because of EU mechanisms, because if you implement all these sanctions, but the US through Trump or whatever, through Bolsonaro, or what, I mean, from the external parties, governments receive, for instance, compensating funds. So we can see that some limitations might be not because of the EU itself, but because of this global level setting. So my push would be like that we incorporate that democracy in the EU Latin America, but also to think about this question beyond the regional level, because from the beginning, at least, of the research to now, I think it became more and more the case that the global level matters, also for the EU, in the sense of very directly speaking, for instance, Obama. And then in the case of Hungary itself, I was going to ask then more to the presentation, Bettina, because you mentioned, and this now we have all this research about the lack of success of the conditionalities, and also Latin America dealing with Venezuela and not dealing with Brazil so many times, and all the cases we discussed yesterday, and Cuba. So it was just a question if you could talk a little bit more about these new mechanisms, because you said it's also, in a way, the mechanism of sanctioning, but what else? I mean, if this is already having an effect, or so it's to put our question on what's happening in the case of Hungary and this instrument. And also because you referred to the Conference of the Future of Europe, and I was very, very interested to know more about that, but I know we don't have time to do everything today now, but just if you could mention, because you finished concluding also with the role of the council and the presidencies, and as you mentioned, Czech presidency was not as pushy, but now Sweden as a presidency, and we saw also in Dimitri's presentation that Sweden has actually, I'm not calling very close Sweden, but apparently Sweden has also moved to the far right. So how important do you think that can be? I mean, because the EU has many more institutions. It's not like Latin America, as we discussed yesterday, the presidentialism, that the presidency is so important at the national level, but at the EU level, the presidency is also, it should exert leadership. So do you think this could be a problem? I mean, when you have these conservative countries, presidents or prime ministers leading the presidency of the EU, how much space do they have, and how can other mechanisms control that, so to speak? So this is a question. And then for Dimitris, I had also a very specific question, because when we're talking about also this broader level, and then you refer to Ukraine directly, I mean, and here the question was, well, in the same direction of what I was asking Bettina, in a way, how can EU foreign policy incorporate that in its own response, so to speak, to the crisis? In the case of Ukraine, we had a webinar about from the network already, and we see that in the case of Latin America, it's very difficult to have common positions there. So how important do you think it's this again to expand on the discussion of democracy because of even geopolitical issues? I mean, they are linked to the extent that you have these coalitions of these governments. And then Nicola, I'm also talking about, fascinated with this topic and very concerned. And I think all that we're talking about is the privacy, because this is democracy. So I think even in the presentation, like to put that this is key, because when you're talking about control, one thing is to have the government or the central bank controlling you, if it's a democracy, and the other thing is that suddenly and it changed from one day to the other, no, as we saw in Brazil. So I mean, all the positive aspects, you mentioned the transaction costs, and that is an economic aspect. I think it's positive, but perhaps also there are other even positive elements of having all those digital currencies. But on the negative side, I think you emphasize a lot the privacy. And so my question is that because on the positive side, you could think you could deal with illicit trade, drugs, and then a lot of issues in Latin America, even new Latin American relations that goes to the drug traffic and so on, well, people trafficking and so many things that to be able to track would be important and perhaps helpful. But yes, there's always the issue of privacy. So do you think it's possible to handle that with regulation? Because you can imagine a good regulation that put rights to the citizens, as you said, some percentage of transactions that you're free to use. But do you think that a legalistic approach to that will be enough, or will all be in the hands of some super powerful government that can control everything we do, as in other literature we've been discussing, no? Not the first digital currency, but surveillance, or also cameras and so on. So just for to think about this positive and negative, and to have so we don't forget the view of through democracy, not only the transaction costs, because we might lose everything in the end, wanting to cost some transaction, to reduce some transaction costs. But thank you very much, just to continue the debates.
Kai would.
Thank you. Very interesting. I'm not going to ask Nicola anything because I don't really understand anything about it, other than it got me quite worried. But there you go. So I'll ask Dimitris and Bettina, which is I'm concerned about two things really in the whole debate about the rise of populism, which is that we always classify them as right wing, which they obviously are in many respects. But actually, when you look at the social policies and so forth, they're quite left wing. They believe in big states. They spend an awful lot of public money to look after their clientele. In Italy, we'll see similar things. If the AfD ever came into power in Germany, they do similar things. And what they've done, I think, very skillfully, politically speaking, is link conditionality and punishment by the EU for supposed democratic backsliding to, well, they're not letting us look after you the way we would like to, because they're threatening funds and they're threatening this and they're threatening that. And we haven't really, I think, and that's my question, or have we, has the EU been able to address that, or how can the EU address that, that actually they're right-wing and nationalist, and so, but in many ways they're quite social democratic, I would argue, and they've very skillfully linked their social democratic elements to make the EU look bad, in inverted commas. And I think the EU, and that's my personal opinion, I'd like your view on it. The EU has been far too compliant in letting them push that narrative. And the recent the current negotiations between the Commission and Hungary about how much money they're going to get of the recovery funds actually play right into that. They play right into that. So we give them 70.5 billion or give them 10 billion, or and Orban has actually exploited that really skillfully. What can or what should the EU do differently to not let that narrative, or to confront that narrative?
Okay, so I have a question for Bettina and Dimitris and one to Nicola. For Bettina and Dimitris, it's the same question. Both of you describe these EU policies to deal with the pandemic as much better than the policies that were devised to deal with the global financial crisis and the European debt crisis in several terms. They were more transparent, more based on solidarity. They sorted the crisis more quickly. They generated public content, support for these policies, increased EU legitimacy, and all that. So it's a rosier picture than we had before. And both of you explain these more positive policies in terms of lessons learned. So the EU learned from the past. It learned from the rise of populism, far right, and public discontent. But I wonder if there aren't other factors, structural factors, conjunctural factors that made the EU adopt different policies now compared to a few years ago, or if not, if you think it's mainly lessons learned. I was thinking maybe some different shifts of power, even like structurally. So yes, if there's any other factors in terms of context that might explain the shifts of policies. And to Nicola is a similar question to Andrea, just try to push you to relate what you were speaking about this digital cash to democracy. And I think, like you said, this digital cash reduces transaction costs, can reduce international dependency when you talked about Visa and MasterCard, the case of the European Union, but reduces privacy and potentially increases government surveillance and control of its citizens. And I wonder if you could expand a bit more. How does this digitalization of money can impact on democracy, both positively and negatively? So that's it. Shall anybody else? Briseño? No? Okay, so shall we follow the same order? So Bettina, Dimitris, and Nicola? Maybe we can do like this so Dimitris can see Bettina, so we don't have to.
Does it work? The microphone? Okay, so it's a lot of questions. I don't know. I hope I don't forget the different aspects. I start maybe from the back forward. Other aspects that may have played apart from lessons learned. Yes, I mean, I mentioned also that all countries were more or less equally affected and had to act immediately. So that has played into it very strongly, I think. But maybe there's an additional thing because we're now affected by the war and by the energy crisis. And for example, we had a delegation to the IMF a month ago, and the IMF is predicting another recession and basically then saying
we should only like give assistance now to the most vulnerable and not give out money to companies, SMEs, and so on. Yeah. And there I felt a strong reluctance on the part from the MEPs because actually also saying this could have a democratic consequences in the sense of more nationalism. So I think that they have learned these lessons and they are afraid about such impacts. I do believe that. So to Kai, um, but I don't quite agree because I see, for example, in Austria, our FPÖ, which is the extreme right wing, when they were in government with our People's Party, they had no social concern. Yeah? That was the time when there was the most cutting of social rights, putting out the trade unions of decision making, and so on. So, and on the European Parliament level, we have different groups where the extreme right is assembled. One is the ECR, and one is the non-Inscrit. So the non-Inscrit is like a more diversified group. There, I think you're right. There are more the groups that are probably more socially minded. But the bigger group is the ECR. And when I see what kind of amendments they bring into the legislative process, they are not social. Yeah, they are not. Absolutely not. And so I don't think that maybe that they can play with this sanction process, and that is interesting because Andrea also would like to know more about it. So what happened is that basically Hungary has been blamed of many aspects of like rule of law violations, not just like press, public freedom of expression, minorities, refugees, but the strongest corruption, so misappropriation of EU funds, yeah? And also justice system, while in Poland has mainly been blamed on like limiting the judiciary system. Yeah, so it's different, but it's also very strong because what is very important for the EU, if these countries and in Poland even they have made a legislation where they say where EU law and the Supreme Court ruling of Poland collide, Supreme Court ruling of Poland is overwhelming. If that every country of the EU must, there is no more EU because then there are no rules to be more applied. So for us, the rule of law is fundamental for the functioning of the EU. And in the negotiations, so they have already made some agreements with Poland. They have disciplinary court where they would go against judges that would not follow the line of the ruling party. Yeah, so that is of course an infringement of the freedom of the judiciary system or the independence. Yeah, and so that they already agreed to abolish it. Yeah, but there are more demands also, like to that all the rules that judgments that they have done should be annulled. Yeah, and also that the judges that they have removed because they were not according to the line of the government line, that they are being placed into position again. That has not happened yet, and that is why the EU, in Poland they are much further because they have agreed on a recovery program, but the money is not paid out. Yeah, and the money is not paid out until at least these like 3 minimum condition milestones, as they call it, are being fulfilled. And in Hungary has now made some improvements in the anti-corruption laws because they consider that is actually the main reason that they don't get EU funds, because of course nobody will give them millions or billions of money when you cannot ensure that the money is not misused, no, misappropriated. So they have not received any money yet, and I think that to give it to them because not to increase the populism there, that would increase the populism in Germany and in other countries if you give it to them. Okay, then coming to another aspect from Andrea. I was at the global level. I think that was what I didn't answer. Yeah, I didn't refer to it, but in fact, there is a very strong interrelation because we have a strong risk for our democracy from inside, from the national, and from outside. Yeah, and outside we can see with the war in Ukraine, it's an autocrat country that is attacking another country that has major impact for the European Union because it's in Europe and many countries are on the border, and we have the refugees, we have the economic impact, we have now the sanctions, so this has major impact. Now we cooperate very strongly with the US on sanctions, but at the same time, so there's like the effort to counteract against anti-democratic decisions and move actions. But at the same time, also we need to maybe have a bit more an independent approach to enter more into dialogue with Russia. I think it is very important because our main interest is also that this war comes to an end soon. It's not a prolongation of the war, and that we can live in peace with Russia at some moment too, not have this eternal conflict. Then at the same, and also with the Trump government, that was a major destabilization of the multilateral system. And for the EU, I think we were very much affected because it was kind of a blind belief in free trade, yeah. And now all of a sudden, one of the major pillars is America first and abolishes in the arbitrary board in the WTO and such things. I mean, so that is like that was a major strike through, but also the American attitudes to in the pandemics with the vaccination, with the mask and so on, and it has made a change in the attitude of Europe. Because before it was like always blind belief in free trade, but now we understand we need some strategic autonomy in some products, like not have no production of mass, not have total dependence in energy, yeah. And so this has some changes now, also for Europe, yeah, in the philosophy also, yeah. And then there was the last thing about the Conference of Europe. Yes, this is a major obstacle are, of course, the member states that are not willing for treaty change. And also treaty change is a tricky thing, yeah, because it needs only one to prevent. It's a veto right, yeah. So many are not so willing to put so much energy into it when there's a very high probability that it doesn't come to a conclusion because it needs one that says no. But at the moment, also we have a window of opportunity because those countries that were the most reluctant are like the Eastern European and some of the heartland that now with the war in Ukraine, they will also need treaty change if they want to have a more leeway with defense money. Yeah, so that actually opens the way. So once you open the treaties, then there will be more questions on the table. Yeah, and the parliament is pushing. Macron was pushing, but and they would have to open the convention would only need a simple majority. So they didn't to open it, not to go. But he didn't put it on the vote. We were waiting for it. It didn't come, and that's why now in the parliament they said, okay, we'll take more time. First, they thought they would want to have the European Parliament's position for the Swedish presidency, but now they actually are going to work until the next summer for the next presidency to have our position. Our position will be, we have already a position, we want the convention, but our position is this treaty, this article should be changed like this. So very concrete, we are very concretely working on that right now. And when I come back, actually, in Econ, we already have the amendments, and we will start negotiating on economic issues, on these issues. And I've seen the amendments, and I think there are even from conservative parties, and so there are a lot of lines where probably there can be found some agreements, but you never know in the end. No, it's all up to the MEPs. Yeah, so I think that, but we go a parallel approach, also like the Commission. So what we do is we try to do as many changes within the existing legal framework, and in parallel draft changes of the treaties.
Thank you, Bettina. So Dimitris?
Yes, thank you for the questions. Okay, let's start with your question first. Why the reasons for the different reaction to the pandemic compared to the previous crisis. I think there are a number of factors at play here. Obviously, I mentioned this in you said that, I mentioned this in my presentation, lessons learned from the previous crisis. I think also Bettina mentioned is the nature of the crisis. There are here, I think, two aspects. First, the humanitarian nature of the crisis. This is not simply economic crisis, but human lives were involved. And the way this crisis began in Europe as well, in Italy and Spain, with the images that we got, particularly from Italy at the beginning, were very shocking to Europe, and therefore kind of mobilized people to react in a much more coordinated way. And also it was more symmetrical because this was again a medical crisis, a health crisis. This was not, you could not be blamed on the bad, lazy Greeks or whatever. This was something, that was out of the control of anybody. It hit everybody at the same time, and it had humanitarian as well costs. So these aspects of the nature of the crisis, I think, helped. Also, as I mentioned this before, there was a threat to the integrity of the common market, which is particularly important for Germany, for example, because at the very beginning of the crisis, though different countries adopted national measures, for example, to safeguard medical supplies and other stuff, which actually created problems for the operation of the common market. I think this was very important, particularly to Germany, and I think we need to know Germany's role. I mean, the main difference between the two countries is that Germany changed course. I mean, in the first couple of months, actually, we had a replay of the earlier crisis. So, if you remember, we had people, heads of states, writing to the Commission to have a common bond issue, and this was rejected by the so-called frugal countries, the North. And all this changed really once Germany closed ranks with France and made a common proposal. And I think, so the real question is why Germany changed its mind. And I think this is, again, it has to do with the nature of the crisis. The stakes were different and much higher. The threat of the common market, which was very important, I think, for Germany, and also domestic politics as well. At that time, Scholz was a finance minister, and he followed a more social democratic, if you like, kind of approach, a more solitaire approach to the European, and more relaxed approach to European finances and how the EU could help different countries. So I think he was influential in this kind of turn. And also I think Merkel softened her approach because she was approaching the end of her chancellery. I mean, she was thinking about her legacy in a sense, and I don't think she wanted to be the one to be blamed to leave entire countries at the mercy of the pandemic, or even worse, given the legacy of the previous crisis, all the problems that many countries had, particularly in the south, lead to a major crisis in the EU. Because I think if this good response, good reaction we described with Bettina didn't happen this time, right after the previous crisis and all the problems it had left behind, I think we would be talking now about whether the EU is going to break up or not. There wouldn't be any European future, I think. So I don't think Merkel wanted that to be part of her legacy. So domestic politics and the different nature of the crisis, I think, were major reasons. So for that. Now, the Kai's question is very interesting. I agree to some of his assessment. I mean, populism is of course in Europe as well. We had left-wing populism in the south during the crisis. We had mostly right-wing populism in the eastern north parts of Europe. Actually, I was involved recently with an Horizon big program on populism, and people who did the conceptual work, if you like, identified different categories of populism. And for example, the regimes in Hungary and Poland were identified as authoritarian populism, which does not fit easily along a right and left kind of continuum. So, I kind of agree with what he says. Again, Bettina is also right. Of course, this does not apply to every populist, right-wing populist regime, but in many cases, you do have a big state, strong social policy kind of tradition combined with otherwise authoritarian many times. I think what you need to do is be far, in my view is that EU should be, and it needs probably treaty revision to do this, and I don't know if there's appetite for this, to be much more aggressive when it comes to rule of law issues, or more generally, with member states which attack core values of the union. I think even suspending a member state from the common market would be a good idea in my view. I mean, these countries, for example, Hungary, Poland, have gained largely because of their participation in the common market and have hubs in global value chains, and they're using this wealth originating from their participation in the EU to undermine EU core EU values. So it's kind of ironic. So my ideal would be to be far more aggressive in terms of the EU's reaction. And to Andrea's question, well, what is good for the EU, as we described with Bettina, is not necessarily good for the world. The very positive, very good vaccine procurement policy for EU actually was not very good for the rest of the world, because they use other developed economies and in Western states over procured vaccines, which left much fewer vaccines for the rest of the world, particularly for the developing countries and the least developed countries. So it was a good policy for European states, but not so good for the not European states. I think what is needed is more international cooperation, more multipolar cooperation, obviously. For example, also even in the, Andrea mentioned the EU foreign policy and the war, although as I showed with the Eurobarometer data, overall European public is in favor of EU's reaction, there are many differentiations. For example, in many countries, many people disagree with the military participation of the EU, the supply of arms, for example, to Ukraine and so on. And actually in Greece, for example, the majority of people disagree with that kind of policy. They don't want Greece to send arms or military aid to Ukraine. So if you kind of put this kind of aid to Ukraine in a more multipolar, for example, in the context of the United Nations operation, I think that will increase its legitimacy and its acceptance from European publics. Of course, this is not easy because we are increasingly in a multipolar world. We see that, and the strategic autonomy that Bettina talked about is a EU's reaction to this increasingly multipolar world. So this makes actually international cooperation more difficult. And I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. I don't know how this can be resolved. I think the world has become globalized. We need more cooperation. But as we enter an era of multipolar, perhaps regionalism, this is going to be more and more difficult. And therefore, I think we are up for major challenges in the future. Thank you.
Okay, as we are already running, well, I'm going to be very quickly. So basically, first of all, cryptocurrencies, crypto assets are not central bank currency. We need to be very clear. Could be nothing more different than that. So in terms of crypto asset being used illicitly, yes, that is how now it's working, right? That is why we need regulation. National regulation are not enough. We need a global framework. So that is one point. The second point on El Salvador it fits directly my narrative. Salvador was trying to, dedollarize for many different reasons, and they attempt this, I would say, crazy idea. And you see data on El Salvador. The transaction using bitcoins are irrelevant, and the storage value of bitcoins has been decreasing massively. So El Salvador have lost billions. So it was a stupid idea without any sort of so about the CBDC and the use of illicity. Of course, CBDC is going to have incorporated Okay, basically it's very technical, but central banks are exploring the idea of a tier two system. So they are gonna provide the basic layer, but after they're gonna be licensed financial intermediaries that are gonna provide to customers the service. And as the system right now, they are gonna be the one in charge of anti-money laundering, tax evasion checks. But basically, to also connect with the question of Andrea, if you see all the projects of CBDC, they are setting limits in terms of spending, and they're also applying negative interest rates on CBDC deposit. Why? Because they don't want to, let's say, cause a disintermediation of banks, because that would increase loans interest rates. So they just want to try to push CBDC as a medium of payment. So basically giving, I don't know, let's say 300 euro per month for user to be used with a CBDC wallet, with a part of that that could be completely anonymous. For wholesale transactions, so a CBDC for wholesale transaction, no anonymity, because the corporate transaction should be clear. That could actually help in terms of having a more clear picture and analysis of corporate transaction. I didn't speak about it, but the potential implications of CBDC are enormous also because of the programmability that you can give. So basically what does it mean? It means that you can write and issue CBDC for a specific use. Let's say that, for example, the government wants to give money to buy food to poor people. They can give them access to CBDC, and it's written in the system that the CBDC could only be spent for food. So once you go to the shop and you go to you try to buy cigarettes, the transaction is denied. And that is interesting, but it also has an implication in terms of privacy and so yeah, of course. I think right now there is a problem because do you prefer, this is the question, do you prefer your government to access to your data or private corporations? Because that is what's happening now. That's what's happening now. So this, or both at the same time, So the system is like, I think CBDC is also a great opportunity to reduce the kind of visibility that I'm not concerned about commercial banks, because as I said, they have no idea how to use data. I'm more concerned about new intermediaries, namely big techs. So of course, this balance between privacy and security is also a discussion in terms of how do we guarantee a system to be efficient, as well as to guarantee some basic privacy. And that is why I think in the end, what we need to think about is CBDC is going to be only used as a medium of payment, which already reduced, the kind of operability. So in these terms, which is the degree of privacy that payments should have? And there is also another layer of complexity, that is, if it's a tier two system, are these financial intermediaries allowed to facilitate the transaction, being able to accumulate the data of the transaction? Then the system doesn't change, right? But what the central bank is actually saying, and that is why there is a lot of lobbying by banks and by financial actors, is okay, you can access data, but which kind of data? So CBDC is also an opportunity to kind of improve the degree of privacy that as users are having in this society, because right now, with the increase of digital transaction, we are, without any thinking and without any precaution, providing private corporations with huge amount of data that before didn't have. So there are many layers of complexity. I think the European Central Bank is thinking about it, because there is a serious concern also by European Commission, So I don't have an answer. I think there are the technical solutions, but the problem is that it needs to be a political decision, and that was make it very difficult. Yes.
Okay, so thank you all very much. I think it was a very productive meeting, panel. So we now go to another room, right?
Right.
Okay. So thank you very much. Bye, Dimitris.
Bye.
I guess it's very late there,
See you
right?
next
Bye.
time.
Well, it is. When do we start the workshop now? It's right after?
You are joining us for the workshop as well, then?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so
At least, maybe, I'll send an email to what time
we are very late. In 10 minutes?
10, 15.
Yeah. So they're saying here in 10, 15 minutes, because we have to move to another room.
Okay.
Okay, so see you in a bit.
See you then. Yeah. Bye.